Okay, so there's a very far-reaching sort of look back into both the geological and the historical background. My involvement with the project came really via Russell, but with a project a couple of years ago to do not necessarily medieval focus, but to do some pottery from the clay in the landscape, build a small earth kiln and see if we could fire pots. And there may be one or two people here who remember that project, may even have contributed to it. So this was our first test attempt to do all that. What we demonstrated with that was that for a limited number of clays in the landscape, you could indeed make a kiln, fire it with wood from the landscape, get decent pots out, and a few of them are lurking in the cabinet at the back there. The sort of medieval component of now sort of moving from just can we do this and will the pots fire or will they be a complete disaster, came really with the second phase of the project, where a lot of the questions that were raised by our attempts to do this, to fire the clay and build a kiln, a lot of the questions that we were left with at the end of that were the kind of questions that you thought, well, if we could just do it again and change that and do this and that. So this part of the project was a development from that, which allowed us to look much more widely at the landscape, at the clays, think about the interpretation, and enabled me to spend more time making medieval pots. And that's got to be a good thing, hasn't it? Who wouldn't want to spend more time making medieval pots? So we built a new kiln, and we had the great advantage over medieval forebears that we had a man with a digger, which so digging these holes would have taken us quite a long time. You'll notice that the previous kiln had one sort of firebox, one place to stoke it, and just a chimney in the top. We wanted to advance on that design rather than just repeat it, and so we were going for a kiln that had two fireboxes, and that will become clearer in a minute, but essentially these two holes give you the access to the fireboxes at each end. A firing chamber in the middle, which we still had to dig out by hand because the guy with the digger, brilliant as he was, it's not very easy to dig a circular hole in that detail with a digger. And this is based on a type of kiln that was becoming common throughout the medieval period in eastern and southern England particularly. So there are several good examples of kiln excavations that have this double-ended kiln with a chamber in the middle. We don't know exactly why that move happened, and there were other designs of kilns around at the same time, so it clearly wasn't that this was a huge advance and everybody stopped doing it the old way. But it clearly had enough advantage to make it worth the effort of digging out more holes. The clay that came out of the holes we make into cob, into a sticky, solid substance, which is clay mixed with sand, mixed with hay or straw and water, and trampled in a pit until it forms the most adhesive and gummy stuff you can imagine. It's kind of fun. It's hard work, but it's quite fun to work with. And with it, you can build structures, and the whole kiln is constructed of the soil that came out of the holes. So this is building the arches in the middle. So we have, in the firing chamber, we have 3 bars go across the chamber which the pots will stand on, and they are supported on, or not supported, they're supported by clay at either side, but there are arches in the middle so the flames can get through from the firebox into the body of the kiln up through these slots. We can then use the same cob to make the rest of the kiln. So firstly we want 2 tunnels, one at each end for the fireboxes. We used willow to form the shape of the tunnels, so this is willow from the farm. Created these arch shapes and then built a cob roof over them. Now the willow burns out when you light the firebox, and it doesn't do anything after the kiln is sort of solid. It's not supportive after that, so that's sacrificial. But it keeps the roof in place, or the firebox roofs in place, when the cob is still soft. And finally, moving on to the chamber, you can see the bottom of the chamber wall there. And the final kiln looks like a Submarine, yes. Everybody says it looks like a submarine. There's a vocal group of people who want us to paint it yellow, but we're not going to do that. That's the finished kiln, and the cob then has to be left to dry. It doesn't dry completely, but it's more a case of leaving it to solidify. It becomes drier on the outside, and the cob stiffens up, and it then is strong enough to work with. So while that's happening, we have to make stuff to put in it. We have to make enough pots to fill a kiln. And actually you need more pots than you think to fill a kiln like that. It's not a big kiln, smaller than most of the archaeological examples of this type of kiln, but you still need quite a lot of pots. It's surprising how much you can get in. So making pots in the medieval period was very much along the lines that we would be familiar with if we made pots today. Medieval potters had potter's wheels, and a lot of pottery was made on potter's wheels. Some of the wheels were cart wheels, mounted on their side, driven around with a stick like this to get them up to speed, and then you had to lean in, do a bit of pottery before the wheel stopped, and then go back and do it all again. So not an easy process, although very absorbing, because this gentleman clearly isn't aware that there's a full-scale battle raging just over the wall for this pottery. I mean, pottery is like that. You can lose yourself. And the other sort of potter's wheel was a pair of platforms linked by vertical wooden struts that spun round, and you could kick the bottom with your foot and work on the top, which is more akin to a modern sort of kick wheel. I wasn't using either of those things exactly. I was using something a bit more like this, which you've all walked past on your way into the museum, probably many times. Mine is in slightly better working condition than this one, and it has a bit more metal and a bit less wood, but fundamentally it's the same wheel. So it's a foot-powered wheel, but with a lever that you press rather than kicking the wheel itself. So the idea really was to try and make pots that drew on, and not necessarily copies of, but drew on the Rye pottery examples and medieval pottery forms generally, but particularly the Rye examples, working with essentially the same technology. Clay from the landscape, local clay, purified, prepared in a way that the medieval potters would have been able to use, the system that Russell's just talked about, and using tools that they would have had. So string, bits of wood, animal bones, a knife, but nothing else particularly. So that sort of gives you a framework to work in when you're making something. And the task after that really was to make enough pots to fill the kiln and to try and think about the making of some of the medieval pottery that may have had to be made in a particular way by medieval potters because of the way they were working. So for example, big pots, some of these absolutely stunning big flagons and ewers in the cabinet here. You're talking about 10, 12, maybe a bit more pounds of clay. That's a big lump of clay. It's hard physical work, and doing it on a kick wheel is not easy. These guys really knew what they were doing. And some of it involved learning some new tricks, which was fun. So one idea is that some of these big jugs were actually thrown, not as we would throw them today on an electric wheel, by the right way up, just pulling all the clay up into the pot. But they were actually thrown first one way up, then cut off the wheel, turned upside down, and then the other end was thrown up, and then you turned it back upside down and stood it on a piece of clay and bonded them together to make the bottom of the pot. And it meant you could make a big jug on a kick wheel, where it's very difficult to get really good thin walls down at the bottom. You could make a big jug which was still light and obviously easier to pick up. So it was a lot of fun and really interesting trying to work out how some of these things might have been made. Well, I had fun anyway. And having made our pots, some of them had to be glazed. So in the first project we didn't do any glazing at all, so this was a new step for us. Medieval potters would have used lead glazes, and they would probably have used lead in a raw form, either lead sulfide or lead oxide, neither of which substance are particularly healthy to have handle and to have hanging around in powdered form. So we did use a lead glaze, but the lead in modern you can get from modern pottery glazing is in a form which is much less toxic, much better to handle. Essentially, it's made into a kind of glass that you can use. So this is a lead glaze, and the reason they would have depended on lead glazes is because at the kiln temperatures that you can achieve with the sort of mud kiln that we've built, it's just about the only substance that will cause silica to melt into glass, which is what makes glaze. So the lead is a very, very powerful sort of flux, and at the temperatures that we're working at, the medieval potters could only really have used that as their glaze. Typically they painted it on pretty roughly, sometimes on the inside, sometimes on the outside, very rarely on both, and often just on the neck or somewhere like that. So sometimes it looks like it was decorative, sometimes perhaps more functional, but they didn't cover the whole pot in glaze very often. It was typically used rather sparingly. So then we had to pack it all into the kiln. We ended up with an array of pots, some of which you might be able to see the echoes of certain rye pots in some of these, a variety of different things, and stacking the kiln with those is an interesting, I think if you were good at sort of, I don't know, Tetris or three-dimensional chess or something, it might be more straightforward, but it's really tricky. There are no shelves, so all the pots stand on top of each other. Remember, at this stage, they're not fired, they're just dry mud, so they're pretty fragile. They all stand on top of each other. You have to make sure the glazed bits don't touch other pots, because otherwise they'll stick together. When you get them out of the kiln, they'll be fused together. And you're trying to create a structure which is sort of strong and stable enough that if something does shift a bit, because the pots will shrink when they're fired, if something does shift a bit, the whole thing doesn't collapse. So it takes a bit of thinking about. I'm not convinced that we lost my thinking. Not convinced that we got it completely right, but we did our best. So then comes the bit that everyone is interested in, which is the hot bit. So it took us 14 hours to fire the kiln. Partly that's because you need a very long, slow initial phase to drive all the water out of the pots, because when water turns to steam in the clay, that is when a lot of breakage occurs. So we ran the kiln quite small fires to begin with. It's really difficult actually to keep the kiln under 100 degrees. It's really, really fiddly. But once we're through that phase, you can then start to fuel up the kiln, and by about 500-600 degrees it's starting to glow inside. This is probably 600-700 degrees, and you can see the whole of the inside of the kiln, the structure, the pots and everything are now glowing with a sort of fairly deep red, which is indicative of that temperature. And then in the final phase, you're pushing lots of fuel in, lots of fast burning wood to get instant heat, and for quite a long part of the process you've got flame passing right through the pots. So it's coming up through the kiln, licking its way around the pots and coming out the top of the chimney, and the pots are trapping all this heat. So the kiln worked very well. The kiln worked pretty successfully. We got a temperature in the end of about 1060 to 1070 degrees, which is well up into the sort of earthenware firing range. For any potters out there will be aware of that, but well up into the earthenware firing range that you'd use with a modern kiln. So the kiln worked really well from that point of view. How did we do? The question everybody wants to know. Well, after we finished firing, you shut the kiln up, and then we had to wait a day and a half for it to cool down. In fact, I went to look at it this morning and it's still a little bit warm in the fireboxes, and that was fired on Friday. So there's immense heat retention. But when we could get into it, you can begin to pull out the pots. And we had our successes and we had our failures. So some things, like this cooking pot, were beautifully fired. It's just about perfect. It's got a lovely solid feel to it, good ring. That will be a success. Some things like this, again, rye-inspired sort of flagon. Well, you can see two interesting things there. Firstly, I didn't make the neck like that. The clay has started to melt it's started to soften. So we've actually got it to a temperature beyond where it should be. And we think a lot of the failures we had were because actually the kiln got too hot. In a sense, we were too enthusiastic or too successful. Parts of it, at least. So it may be that the places where we were monitoring the temperature were different from other parts of the kiln. So much of what we see in the failures are the sort of symptoms of overfiring. So the glaze here has bubbled. The blackness here may be a reduction effect, which is when you starve the kiln of oxygen. But on this side, it's actually quite respectable. That's what it was supposed to look like, which suggests that the pot may have simply been in a position where it was exposed to a massive flame from one side and not on the other. So it just suffered from sort of differential heating. So I could show you lots more pictures of pots, but I'm not going to do that. What I want to do is actually use some of the pots over here that you've been able to have a look at, just to say a little bit more, if that's okay, about the sorts of things that we did and tried to do and what happened. So, failures come in different forms. This was one of my favourite jugs, and it now has no bottom and no side, so it's pretty useless as a jug. The glaze has actually worked pretty well, and it's bubbled in places. We did have a whole lot of big jugs reminiscent of the Rye collection. None of them made it through the firing, interestingly. Whether that's something to do with the quality of the way they were made, or the method, or where they were in the kiln, because a lot of them being big, we had them low down in the kiln. We have a lot of sort of diagnostic conversation to have. So that was a failure. The most successful pots in many ways were these cooking pots, which are unglazed, just good solid earthenware pots, and staple of probably many medieval potteries. Not perhaps as exciting as the big jugs, and they don't feature as often in museum cabinets, but I rather like them. They are satisfying. We haven't yet tried cooking anything in it. It may fall to pieces, it may not. We would like to do that experiment. And I think one of the interesting things about making these pots is as you think about them, as you make them, as you start to handle them, you're trying to see through the eyes of medieval potter. Why were they like this? Why did it have a curved bottom? Why not make it flat? Some of them are flat. They clearly could make flat pots, but they didn't always. And that's an interesting question. Probably the answer is something to do with the fact that if you're standing something on an uneven floor or on a fire, then actually a round pot you can you can wedge it onto just about any uneven surface. A flat pot will always suffer from wherever you put it, it won't be a flat surface. The rims, similarly, why do they all have this rim? Very characteristic of medieval cooking pots. And probably, seems to me, the answer is, actually, you've got to pick up a cooking pot. A handle sticking out over a fire gets really hot, completely useless. The rim is protected somewhat from the fire. It's at the top of the pot, so it'll be the coolest bit. This is just to pick them up with. I think. Seems to me quite logical. So, and then there are these sort of guys. I love these. These little, again, cooking vessels, or possibly in some of the case of some of these, they might have been used for other things where you needed to heat things over a fire. So perhaps preparing medicines, or I don't know what else you might be doing, but where you needed to work with small quantities of things over a fire, or possibly over an oil lamp or something like that, for gentle heating. They're just full of character, these things. Here's one that went through the wood firing, perfectly fired. The glaze is lovely, even, smooth, transparent, just as it should be. The pot is good and solid. I mean, that will be a success. I wouldn't make my living as a medieval potter if this is my ratio of success to failure, but it's nice when it happens. They always say you learn more from the failures than from the successes, and that's absolutely true, but it's nice when they don't have all failures. So it's nice to have things that work out well. And one of the things that's been really interesting is exploring in a bit more detail the records, the archaeological records from the Rye digging. So most of the pots in here are I love them, the big iconic, the things that really feel like this is what the medieval potters did and what they were good at. What's interesting when you go into the records is that they also made lots of other things. It was surprising how much medieval potters made in the way of other things than big jugs or cooking pots. So I had a go at making a few of those things, again based on remains from the Rye excavations. So this is a medieval flask. It's called a costrel, and it's thrown. So in the Rye excavations, and commonly what you find is the top part, the neck, and the top of the flask. And these will all be over there, so I apologise if it's not as easy to see at distance, but you can pick them up and play with them. And yeah, it holds about half a pint, full of wine. That would have been fine. You can have a string, sing it over your shoulder, and put it on your pack or whatever. So they're all thrown in one piece. You throw a pot that goes up like that, and then you slowly close in the top, and then gradually flatten the top down to form that rather convenient flask shape. And this is one of my favourites. This is a medieval money box. And there's one of these from Rye, found in the excavations of the Kiln in Rye. Again, like a piggy bank, you have to break it to get the money out. So good secure system. And very simple. Obviously, you didn't make lots of decoration if you were going to break them to get the money out. But again, thrown in one form, closed over, and then a little slot cut in it. And I rather like those sort of slightly off-the-wall bits of pottery which go a bit more into the everyday life of medieval folk. Any thoughts as to what this one might be? Funny thing with a hole in the top, a handle on the side, so it hangs at an angle. Gentlemen in the audience? It's a medieval urinal, which you would have probably in your chamber. Urine was a valuable thing in medieval times, and I don't know if there was a ladies' model. It's not at all clear from the archaeology, but there are lots of these. So that's again a little bit of an insight into medieval life. And here's my drain pipe. So if you look in the cabinet over there, you'll see the drain pipe that Andrew was talking about. This is based on that drain pipe. It's about the same length. It's actually a little bit shorter because it's quite difficult to make drain pipes. They were very good throwers, medieval potters. You look at some of the stuff in there, those big vessels, the thinness of the clay, the fineness of the throwing, working on a foot-powered wheel with clay that had pretty much come straight out of the ground. They'd probably picked out the worst of the contamination, but this wasn't like the stuff you buy from the clay suppliers. It was very uneven, and they would prepare it as best they could. But when you take 7 or 8 pounds of clay and you want to throw a drain pipe, and you don't, there's not much market for one drain pipe. You've got to make a lot of drain pipes to make a living. So those sorts of things, give you, I think, an insight into the skills required to be a good medieval potter, and I'm acutely aware of the points at which my skill set falls short of that. So the pots over there you can obviously have a look at. The white slip that Russell talked about was interesting from 2 points of view. Firstly, because we'd seen the white clay slip decoration in the Rye pottery, and it was clear that this was a very special thing. It's very unusual to have clay that just doesn't have the iron in it to go to a terracotta colour when you fire it. So when we found it, that was a magical moment. Actually, it was really nice to suddenly realise we'd got the iron clay. There are some tiles we've made over there and the tile making process where you can see how the white clay and the other clay are put together to make the final tiles. Those weren't done in the wood kiln because we just didn't have the right space to fire lots of tiles along with the other pots. Those were done in an electric kiln, but apart from that they were done with all the same materials. But I just wanted to finish really with this pair, which a couple of reflections. So firstly, that sort of brings us back to the white slip and the decoration, and interesting speculations about what the decoration might have been for. But I rather like these two. So this is one of my failures. This is one of the failures by a Rye potter 600 odd years ago. So got a big crack down here, probably couldn't sell that one, which is why it was found on the pottery site. the excavation site of the kiln, because most of the pots that you find around a potter's kiln are the ones that failed, the wasters. So we also have to bear that in mind when we look at things in the cabinet like this and you think, oh, that's a bit of a rough old job, or they didn't do a very good job of that. A lot of these pots from kiln excavations are the ones that failed. But, 600 years separates them, and I kind of like to think they might not be siblings, but they're certainly distant cousins, aren't they?
Absolutely.
So I like to feel I've at least perhaps got a little bit under the skin of the Rye potters in the kind of things that they were doing. I've certainly got a huge respect for what they were able to do. So I think I'm going to stop at that point, and as Andrew said, I think all of us are more than happy to answer questions about any or all parts of the talk. And that's the kiln at dawn.
Okay.